If we stay in this cabin another night, Tom, we are going to bury our youngest daughter in the frozen dirt before the spring thaw even begins. Those raw, trembling words, spoken in the damp dark of a Montana night by Abigail Vance, were not born of dramatic exaggeration, but of the absolute, bone-chilling reality of a wilderness, winter that was slowly reclaiming their home. For Tom Vance, sitting in the flickering shadows of his sputtering hearth, the desperate warning of his wife triggered a memory he had tried for years to leave behind on the barren, wind-scoured rocks of Kiska Island. It was 1943 when Tom, then a young, wet-behind-the-ears combat engineer with the Navy Seabees, first learned what a truly merciless wind could do to the human body and the fragile wooden boxes men built to protect themselves. In the Aleutian Islands, the military did not worry about aesthetic appeal or traditional architecture. They worried about sheer physical endurance against the willy-waw winds that screamed off the Bering Sea at 90 miles per hour, carrying a wet, freezing mist that could rot leather boots and freeze exposed fingers in a matter of 2 minutes. It was there that Tom first saw the military's solution to an impossible climate: the prefabricated, corrugated steel Quonset hut. Erected on frozen ground, sometimes right on top of mud and permafrost, these simple, half-cylinder shelters held their heat with an efficiency that baffled the traditional builders in the ranks. The secret, as Tom observed while helping his Bedu unit bolt the heavy galvanized arches together, was not that the thin steel skin of the Quonset possessed some magical insulating property. On the contrary, bare metal was a terrible insulator, handing off heat to the outside air almost as fast as a fire could produce it. The magic lay entirely in the aerodynamics of the arch and the absolute airtightness of the curved shell once it was properly battened down. In the Aleutians, when the wind scoured the earth, a rectangular, wooden building with sharp corners and flat vertical walls acted like a sail, catching the brute force of the gale. That pressure created a powerful suction on the leeward side, physically pulling the warm air out through every fraced, microscopic gap in the windows, the doors, and the floorboards. But the Quonset's curved surface allowed the wind to slide over it like water over a plumb, smooth stone, preventing the high-pressure and low-pressure zones that literally vacuumed heat out of a building. More importantly, when the Seabees built an interior wooden lining inside those metal arches, leaving a pocket of trapped air between the wood and the outer steel, the air remained almost perfectly still. Still air, as Tom learned from a grizzled master sergeant who had spent his life engineering structures in the frozen wastes of the North, is one of the most effective natural thermal barriers on the planet. If you can stop air from moving, if you can completely eliminate the convective currents that carry warmth away from a warm surface to a cold one, you can keep a space warm with a fraction of the fuel. That basic physical law stayed with Tom long after he signed, received his honorable discharge, and returned to the civilian world. He carried to it with him when he used his hard-earned savings to buy 160 acres of untouched timberland in the Flathead Valley of Montana. He was determined to build a life of peace and self-reliance, away from the thunder of artillery and the endless gray mud of the Pacific. But as he stood on his new land in the autumn of 1946, watching the golden larch needles rain down on the 80 dark soil, he had no idea that the lessons of the Aleutian winds were about to become the only thing standing between his family and a frozen grave. The cabin that Tom Vance built during the humid, mosquito-ridden summer of 1946 was, by any traditional standard of the Montana frontier, an exceptionally well-crafted home. He had selected the straightest, tightest-grained spruce logs from the high ridges of his property, peeling the bark by hand and allowing them to dry under the summer sun until they were light and resonant. He notched each planed log with a double scribe fit, a time-consuming technique that ensured the brighterous timbers nested together so tightly that a thin coin could not be slid between. In them, for the Hmong, he hauled heavy flat stones from the creek bed, stacking them with a thick clay and lime mortar to create a foundation that sat solid on the mountain earth. But Flathead Valley is not a place that rewards standard craftsmanship, no matter how precise. Positioned like a giant geographic funnel between the towering peaks of the Rocky Mountains and the storm-tossed expanse of Flathead Lake, the valley acts as a natural conduit for the Arctic air masses that plunge southward from the Canadian tundra. When those winter winds arrive, they don't merely blow. They descend with a crushing, persistent pressure that scours the land. The first real winter of 1946 to 1947 taught Tom the limits of traditional log construction. Despite his tight joinery and hours spent on his knees stuffing sheep's wool and lime mortar into every microscopic crevice, the cabin could not hold its ground. The spruce logs, while thick, possessed a hidden vulnerability that Tom had not fully anticipated. Wood is a porous material, and while it has a decent resistance to the passage of heat, it is subject to the relentless laws of convective cooling. When a 40-mile-per-hour wind slammed into the north face of the cabin, it scoured the exterior surface of the logs, stripping away the thin boundary layer of warm air that naturally clings to any structure. This constant stripping action created a steep temperature drop across the thickness of the log. Inside the cabin, the logs felt cold to the touch, functioning as giant, active cooling panels that drew warmth out of the room through conduction. To make matters worse, the pressure of the wind physically forced the frigid outside air through the natural pores of the spruce and the tiny, inevitable settling cracks in the chinking. On nights when the thermometer dipped below 15 degrees, Abigail had to stuff tattered rags and old wool socks along the baseboards, only to find them frozen, solid to the floorboards by morning. The emotional heart of the home, however, was not broken by the cold walls, but by the terrifying sound of their 4-year-old daughter Lucy, coughing in the dark. It began in late December as a mild cold, but within weeks, the damp, drafty air of the bedroom turned the bedroom illness into a severe, barking case of croup. On the coldest nights, when the wind licked at the floorboards, the draft under the beds was so strong it would blow out a candle set on the floor 6 feet away. The only way to keep the child's breathing passage open was to maintain a roaring, intense fire in the central hearth. But that fire carried its own danger. To keep the cabin even marginally warm, Tom had to feed the fireplace with green pine and damp cottonwood, the only fuel he had left in his outdoor stack. The wet wood smoldered, producing a thick, heavy smoke, laden with creosote that struggled to rise through the wind-battered chimney. Instead of venting cleanly, the smoke backdrafted into the room, filling the cramped cabin with a dense, acrid haze that irritated Lucy's delicate lungs, turning her nights into a terrifying struggle for air. Abigail would sit on the edge of the bed, rocking the weeping child, her own eyes red from the smoke, while Tom stood by the hearth, stoking the fire until his hands were raw and blistered, knowing that if he let the flames die for even 2 hours, the room would drop to near freezing. It was a cycle of exhaustion and terror that convinced Tom his beautiful log cabin was not a home at all. It was a beautifully crafted trap. By October of 1947, the memory of Lucy's desperate gasps for air was still fresh in Tom's mind, a constant, motivating pressure as he scanned the notice boards at the Kalispell post office. It was there, among the advertisements for used farm implements and lost cattle, that he found his answer: an announcement of a Bull Dot, massive military surplus liquidation auction at the Decommissioned Army Supply Depot in Great Falls. The government was selling off everything from field kitchens to transport trucks, but what caught Tom's eye was a listing for crated, unassembled Quonset huts. Leaving Abigail and the girls with his brother, Arthur, Tom drove his battered, wood-sided Ford truck over the high passes to Great Falls. The auction yard was a chaotic maze of mud and machinery, crowded, with ranchers looking for cheap fencing and scrap metal. When the bidding began, on the Quonset crates, most of the local buyers turned away, viewing the curved steel sheets as useless junk that couldn't be easily adapted for standard farm use. But Tom saw exactly what he needed. He waited until the crowd thinned, and, when the auctioneer called out the final lot of 20-foot by 48-foot Quonset shells, Tom raised his hand. For $75, virtually the last of his winter cash reserve, the metal arches were his. The journey back to Flathead Valley was a test of endurance. The heavy wooden crates containing the curved steel ribs and corrugated paneling weighed nearly 2 tons, overloading Tom's old truck until the leaf springs flattened against the axle. He climbed the steep, icy curves of the mountain passes at 10 miles per hour, the engine roaring in low gear, the tires slipping on the slush. When he finally rolled into the yard of the trading post south of Kalispell, a group of local ranchers and loggers had gathered around the stove, warming their hands and sharing the gossip of the coming winter. Silas Thorne, the owner of the local sawmill and the self-appointed authority on all things construction in the valley, stepped out onto the porch to inspect Tom's cargo. He walked around the truck, poking a finger through the gaps in the crate at the gray, galvanized steel panels. Thorne asked Tom what he planned to do with that pile of junk, asking if he was building a tin barn to store his rust in. Tom replied that he was going to wrap it around his cabin to make a shield. Thorne stared at him for a second, then burst into a loud, mocking laugh that echoed off the timber walls of the post, declaring that wrapping a log house in tin was crazy, and that Tom had spent how much time under that Pacific sun. He warned that metal doesn't hold heat, but steals it, meaning Tom was building a giant icebox, a silver coffin to freeze his family in. The men on the porch joined in the laughter, shaking their heads at the strange veteran who didn't seem to understand the basic rules of the Partican, Montana woods. To them, a home was built of logs, or it wasn't a home at all. Anything else was an insult to the history of the valley and the men who had tamed it. But Tom didn't argue. He climbed back into his overloaded truck, shifted into gear, and drove slowly up the frozen trail to his homestead, leaving the laughter of the town behind him. He had 2 months before the deep freeze, and he had a shield to build. Before we reveal the exact measurements, the exact wood placements, and the physics that made this work, do us a quick favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. Why? Because we are going to show you knowledge that has been buried for over a century, and you will understand why. Modern insulation companies don't want you knowing about these envelope principles. The physical assembly of the Quonset shell over the log cabin was not a matter of simply throwing metal panels over a wooden roof. It required a level of structural engineering that Tom had to invent as he went, using nothing but his instincts and a handful of hand tools. The first challenge was the foundation. The existing cabin sat on a fieldstone footing that was exactly 16 feet wide. The Quonset arches were 20 feet wide at the base, meaning Tom had to extend the foundation 30 inches outward on both the east and west sides to support the new metal walls. Working in the freezing mud of late October, Tom dug a trench down to bedrock around the perimeter of the cabin. He hauled extra, flat stones from the creek, stacking them with a thick, heavy mortar to create a secondary outer foundation wall that sat perfectly level with the original stone. On top of this new masonry base, he bolted heavy 2x6 pine sill plates, anchoring them into the stone with iron expansion bolts he had salvaged from the Great Falls Depot. Once the sill plates were secure, the real labor began. Each of the steel ribs of the Quonset consisted of 3 curved sections that had to be bolted together at the joints to form a single, continuous, semicircular arch. Working alone most days, Tom had to use a block and tackle system rigged to a high spruce tree to hoist each completed arch into place, balancing the heavy steel on his shoulders while he drove the lag bolts through the foot flanges into the timber sill plates. He spaced the arches exactly 4 feet apart along the 48-foot length of the cabin, creating a rigid, rib-like cage that hovered over the spruce log structure. It was during this phase that Tom addressed the critical physical limitation that most amateur builders would have missed. He knew that a 24-inch air gap was, in theory, an excellent thermal buffer. But in practice, a large, unobstructed gap of that size is subject to the dangerous laws of convective looping. When the prial, interior log walls of the cabin warmed the air in the gap, that warm air would naturally rise toward the top of the curve. As it touched the cold, uninsulated steel shell of the Quonset, it would lose its heat, cool down, become dense, and sink back down the outer wall. This created a rolling loop of moving air that would actively carry warmth away from the cabin logs, functioning as a natural, highly efficient cooling loop. To prevent this convective cycle, Tom implemented a highly creative technical innovation, a series of internal wind baffles. Using rough-cut pine boards and scrap tar paper, he built horizontal and vertical partitions within the 24-inch gap, dividing the large, continuous corridor into 16 separate, isolated air compartments. These draft stops functioned as thermal locks, trapping the air in small, confined chambers where it could not establish a rolling convective loop. By restricting the physical movement of the air, Tom converted the entire 24-inch gap into an active, highly effective thermal barrier of still air, mimicking the insulation properties of a modern multi-pane window on a giant scale. Next, Tom addressed the potential disaster of moisture accumulation. If warm, humid air from the, quote, cabin's interior leaked through the log walls and contacted the cold underside of the steel shell, it would condense into liquid water, dripping down onto the logs and creating a perfect environment for rot and mold. To prevent this, he installed a series of screened baffled vents near the foundation base and at the ridgeline of the Quonset. These vents allowed a slow, controlled exchange of air within the outer compartments, carrying away any trace moisture before it could condense, while maintaining the still air buffer. For the entryway, Tom built a small, double-doored airlock vestibule on the southeast side of the front structure. When entering the home, a person had to step through the outer wooden door into a small insulated holding area, close the first door, and then open the inner cabin door. This simple mechanism prevented the blast of freezing outside wind from directly entering the living space, preserving the stable interior climate with every transition. He sealed the joints of the Quonset panels with thick tar paper and galvanized bolts, tightening each flange until the entire silver shell sat rigid and silent under the autumn sky. It was an unconventional, visually bizarre structure. But as Tom tightened the final bolt on the double flash collar around his chimney, he knew that the physics were solid. The shield was complete. The completion of the Quonset shield did not silence the critics in Flathead County. It merely focused their skepticism into more specific, technical arguments. By mid-November, as the larch trees stood bare and the first gray clouds of winter began to gather on the northern horizon, the Vance homestead had become a regular stop for local builders and self-appointed experts who wanted to examine the metal monstrosity before the snow locked the roads. Silas Thorne arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, driving a wagon loaded with freshly cut green timber from his mill. He did not get out of his seat at first, sitting, with the reins in his hands, staring at the corrugated silver dome that now completely enclosed the log cabin he had watched Tom build the year before. Thorne called out to Tom, shouting that he had built a monument to his own stubbornness. He mentioned that he had been talking to some of the old-timers down in Kalispell, who predicted that the steel shell would sweat so badly that Tom would have an indoor river by January. He warned that the moisture would have nowhere to go, pooling on the spruce logs, and by spring, the beautiful house would be so rotten that a finger could be pushed right through the timber. Tom explained that he had built 6 vents, baffled to keep the weather out, allowing the air to move just enough to dry the moisture, but not enough to carry the heat. Thorne snorted, flicking a fly off the horse's back with his whip, and declared that 6 little holes would never handle the condensation from a whole family and a burning stove. He asserted that Tom had trapped his family in a damp cave that would be cold, wet, and miserable, and warned that when the metal got down to 30 below, it would draw the heat out of the cabin like a sponge draws water. Later that week, Tom's own brother, Arthur, came down from Whitefish. Arthur was a traditional carpenter who prided himself on his straight lines and classic designs, and he looked at the Quonset dome with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. He told Tom that he was making them a laughingstock, saying that people in town were whispering that Tom had lost his nerve after the Tinkin' first winter and was too soft for Montana. He argued that a real man builds a solid log house, chinks it tightly, and keeps his fire stoked, rather than wrapping his home in a surplus army shed like a coward. Tom looked at his brother's tense face and reminded him that their girls had been freezing, that Ruth had been sleeping in her coat, and Lucy had been choking on smoke because he had to burn green wood just to keep the room above 40. He declared that he didn't care about looking tough, but only about keeping them healthy. Arthur gestured angrily at the curved steel ceiling above them, claiming it was dangerous, and asking what would happen under a real snow load. He questioned if a 4-foot drift would slide off, or if it would pile up on the sides and crush the ribs, arguing that the Army hadn't built these things for Montana winters, but for temporary storage in the desert. He accused Tom of risking his family's safety on a theory he brought home from the war. Even Robert Mercer, the newly appointed county agricultural extension agent, felt compelled to register his professional concern during his monthly tour of the valley homesteads. He stood in the yard with his leather-bound notebook, taking measurements of the outer wren, foundation, and checking the clearance of the chimney stack. Mercer warned Tom that his double-envelope design was completely untested in the climate, and that the thermal properties of still air in a 24-inch gap were highly unstable. He cautioned that if the draft stops failed to prevent convection, the home could experience rapid, uncontrolled heat loss that the fireplace would not to be able to overcome. Furthermore, he noted that the metal skin represented a severe condensation hazard that could compromise the structural integrity of the log cabin within 2 seasons, meaning he could not recommend the design to other settlers. Tom listened to them all, his face showing the quiet, unyielding patience of a man who had dug trenches in frozen mud while artillery shells whistled overhead. He did not argue, did not present his calculations, and did not seek their approval. He simply thanked them for their concern, escorted them to their wagons, and went back inside his home to make sure the woodbox was full. By the final week of November, the transition was complete. The Vance family had Darnhan into the double-shell structure, abandoning the exposed outdoor spaces and settling into the unique, silent environment Tom had engineered. The physical contrast between their old life and this new existence was immediate and profound. Step through the inner door of the spruce cabin, and you entered a world that felt strangely insulated from the natural rhythm of the valley. In the 24-inch corridor between the log walls and the steel Quonset shell, the air sat in a heavy, draft-free silence. The constant, howling wind that had rattled the window frames and whistled through the floorboards of the cabin. The previous winter was gone, replaced by a deep, muffled quiet. The sound of the wind was still there, but it existed only as a distant, hollow rumble vibrating against the outer steel arches, far from the thick spruce logs. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was clean and still. Lucy's breathing had improved within days of their move. Without the freezing drafts licking at the floorboards, Tom did not have to run the fireplace at the roaring, desperate levels of the desperate previous winter. He could maintain a moderate, clean-burning fire using dry, seasoned birch and larch that he had split during the dry days of September. The smoke rose straight and true through the chimney stack, venting cleanly into the function sumpered of aid, cold sky, without the dangerous backdrafts that had filled the room with acrid haze. Abigail found herself adjusting her daily routine with a sense of wonder that was almost indistinguishable from relief. She no longer had to wear her heavy wool shawl while cooking at the stove. The water bucket set near the door, which had regularly frozen over with an inch of ice during the previous November nights, remained liquid, its surface showing only the slight vibration of the wind against the outer shell. Abigail remarked that it felt like they were sleeping inside a cocoon, telling Tom that she kept waiting for the cold to find them, but it just stayed out there, vibrating against the tin. But the valley was not ready to let them enjoy their quiet victory. At the Stevensville Trading Post, the skepticism had hardened into a formal wager. Silas Thorne, standing before the counter with a cup of black coffee, had laid a $10 gold piece on the table. He announced to the gathered ranchers that he was putting $10 down that Tom's steel dome would freeze out before the new year. He predicted that when the Arctic air mass hit in December, the metal would turn into a giant cooling fin, and Tom would be hauling his family to Arthur's place. In Whitefish, with their teeth chattering and their woodpile gone, no one took the bet. The memory of the previous winter was too fresh, and the belief in traditional log construction was too deeply ingrained in the culture of the Rock to Valley. To them, Tom's experiment was a dangerous aberration, a foolish attempt to bypass the hard reality of mountain life through a clever trick. They respected his service in the war, but they did not respect his design. Winter was coming, the great, unforgiving judge of the northern plains, and it was about to deliver its verdict on the Quonset-covered cabin. The great storm of December 1947 began not with a sudden blast of wind, but with a silent, heavy descent of cold air that seemed to press down on the Flathead Valley like an invisible weight. On the afternoon of December 8th, the barometer at the Kalispell weather station began a rapid, precipitous fall, dropping lower than it had during the entire winter of 1946. By sunset, the temperature had fallen to 18 below zero. By midnight, it was 25 below. And then the wind arrived. It came from the northwest, a sustained, freezing gale that swept down from Canada at 45 miles per hour, with gusts that reached 60. The storm was what meteorologists would later call a bomb cyclone, a massive, fast-moving low-pressure system loaded with Arctic moisture that turned the valley into a horizontal white wall of blowing snow. Within 12 hours, the roads were drifted shut, with snow packed so hard that horses could not find footing. Across the Thunglung, families entered survival mode. The cold was not merely uncomfortable. It was lethal, a persistent force that searched for every person's thesache, weakness in every structure. At the Colby Ranch, 2 miles south of the Vance property, the family had to abandon their bedrooms by the second night. The north wall of their cabin, built of standard 10-inch pine logs, had developed frost on the inside surfaces, the moisture from their breath freezing into white sheets that coated the timber. They dragged their mattresses into the kitchen, crowding around the cast-iron stove, stoking it with coy every hour through the /Prumacan night. Despite their efforts, The floor-level temperature in their home stayed at 28 degrees, 4 degrees below freezing. At the Thorne household, Silas Thorne was discovering the limits of his barn with windbreak panels. The north side of his structure had taken the full brunt of the gale, and the wind had forced its way through the joints in the steel roof, creating drifts inside the building that buried his machinery and threatened his livestock. His water line, which ran from a well 50 feet away, froze solid on December 30th when the frost line penetrated 4 feet into the soil. He had to haul water from his house in metal buckets, the water freezing at the edges before he could reach the trough. His propane heaters, running full blast to prevent his breeding stock from freezing, were consuming fuel at an unsustainable rate, burning through his winter supply by January 4th. The situations at other homesteads were even more desperate. 2 families reported their chimneys had cracked under inlet as the extreme thermal stress of maintaining roaring fires against the sub-zero exterior temperatures. Another rancher lost 6 head of cattle when they huddled against a 3-sided shelter and froze standing, the wind chill of minus 65 degrees stripping their body heat faster than their metabolism could replace it. Men made dangerous, nighttime trips to their woodpiles, their hands numbing through heavy leather gloves, risking frostbite to find dry logs. Many were forced to burn green wood, which produced little heat and filled their cabins with a thick, choking smoke that made sleep impossible. It was a week of relentless, exhausting struggle, a reminder that on the Montana frontier, comfort was not an option. It was a fragile, hard-won state that could be shattered by a single storm. On the morning of Christmas Eve, the 24th of December 1947, the storm had reached its peak of severity. The temperature outside the Stevensville trading post read 38 below zero, with a wind chill that made it feel like 70 below. Silas Thorne, his face wrapped in a heavy wool scarf that was stiff with frozen.com breath, stood by his wagon, loading several cords of seasoned larchwood. He had spent the morning delivering emergency fuel to families who had burned through their supplies, and now he was headed south toward the Vance property. He did not expect to find Tom Vance and his family in good condition. Indeed, he expected to find their cabin frozen out, perhaps with their pipes burst and their daughters huddled around a cold hearth, waiting for rescue. He had brought along extra blankets and a gallon of hot soup Margaret had prepared, determined to do his duty as a neighbor, even if it meant admitting he had won the wager. The drive up the trail to the Vance homestead took Silas nearly an hour, his team of draft horses struggling through the knee-deep drifts that blocked the team of draft horses' path. When he finally rolled into the yard, he was surprised to see no smoke pouring from the cabin's chimney. Only a thin, steady wisp of white vapor rose from the stack, barely visible against the gray sky. He climbed down from the gray sky wagon, his joints aching from the brutal cold, and walked to the outer entrance of the Quonset shell. He knocked on the heavy wooden door of the airlock. Within seconds, the door opened, and Tom Vance stood there. Thorne stepped into the Periad vestibule, pulling off his scarf, and stood frozen in his tracks. Tom was wearing a simple flannel shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, and no coat. Behind him, the inner door to the log cabin was open, and through the opening, Silas could see Abigail sitting at the kitchen table, sewing. On the floor nearby, Mary and Lucy were playing with their dolls, wearing light cotton dresses and no white sweaters. The warmth that rolled out of the cabin was not the hot, suffocating heat of an overstoked stove. It was a gentle, even warmth that felt like a spring afternoon. Silas stood in his heavy, snow-covered coat, his boots dripping onto the clean floor, and stared at the family in absolute silence. He asked Tom what the temperature was inside, and Tom walked to the wall thermometer, showing him that it was 63 degrees, having been 68 earlier in the afternoon. Thorne walked to the thermometer, his fingers trembling as he adjusted his spectacles to read the scale. The mercury sat clearly and undeniably at 63. He touched the inner spruce log wall. It felt warm, almost like it had been sitting in the sun. There was no frost vowel, no dampness, no draft at his ankles. He asked Tom how he was doing this, noting that he had been delivering wood to freezing families all morning who were struggling at 40 degrees while burning half a cord a day, while Tom's chimney was barely smoking. Tom explained that they were burning about 3/4 of a cord every 2 weeks because the air gap stopped the wind before it touched the logs. He detailed how the wood draft stops kept the air still, acting as the best insulation available, which meant he only needed a small fire to maintain the temperature of the logs rather than a giant fire to heat the entire room. To prove his point, Tom pulled a small, leather-bound notebook from his desk and handed it to Silas. It was the temperature log he and Abigail had kept throughout the storm, a meticulous record of their survival. Thorne turned the pages with gloved hands, reading the entries for the worst day of the freeze, December 12th. At 6 in the morning, the outside temperature was minus 31 degrees, the gap temperature was 15, and the cabin was 62. By 10 in the morning, the outside dropped to minus 35, the 45, gap rose slightly to 16, and the cabin held at 63. At 2 in the afternoon, the outside hit minus 38, the gap was 18, and the blank cabin stayed at 64. At 6 in the evening, the outside was minus 34, the gap was 14, and the cabin was 61. By 10 at night, the outside read minus 32, the gap was 12, and the cabin was 60. At 2 in the morning, the outside dropped to minus 36, the gap held at 11, and the cabin was 58. Silas closed the notebook slowly, his mind struggling to accept the physical reality of the numbers. In the worst cold the valley had seen in 75 years, Tom's cabin had held its warmth to within a few degrees throughout the day and night, using a fraction of the fuel his neighbors consumed. The tin coffin had proved to be one of the most efficient thermal structures in the western United States. The verification of Tom Vance's success came on the 2nd of January 1948, when Robert Mercer, the county agricultural extension agent, returned to the homestead. Mercer had spent the previous 2 weeks assessing the extensive storm damage across the district, and he brought with him a calibrated spirit thermometer determined to conduct a proper, scientific investigation of the Quonset-covered cabin. He spent nearly 3 hours at the site, taking measurements of the bruise, exterior wind velocity, the air temperature in different sections of the 24-inch gap, and the moisture levels on the surfaces of the spruce logs. His findings, which he recorded in his official report to the commission, validated every physical principle Tom had applied. The primary mechanism of heat retention, Mercer noted, was the absolute elimination of wind-driven, convective cooling on the cabin's exterior walls. Montana's persistent winter winds normally create a boundary layer strip-off effect, where the wind scours the warm air away from the cabin logs, accelerating heat transfer through conduction. By enclosing the cabin within the airtight Quonset shell, Tom had stopped that wind at the outer boundary. The air within the 24-inch gap, while cold, was virtually static, moving at less than 2 miles per hour, even when outside winds exceeded 50. This still air functioned as a powerful insulating layer. Because still air has a low thermal conductivity, it resisted the transfer of heat from the warm log walls to the cold steel shell. But Tom's implementation of the wooden wind baffles was what made the system work at such a high level of efficiency. Without those draft stops, the temperature difference between the warm inner logs and the cold outer metal would have generated large rolling convective loops, carrying heat away from the house through convective transfer. The baffles had successfully compartmentalized gap, breaking the large loop into 16 isolated, stable compartments where air could not move with enough velocity to transfer heat. The thermal performance calculation Mercer prepared was startling. He noted that the R value of the 12-inch spruce logs was 14.4, while the R value of the still air gap with the baffles was 86.4. The uninsulated but airtight steel shell added a minor 0.5, bringing the total effective wall insulation value of Tom's structure to a staggering 101.3. Compare this to the standard log cabin of the era, which possessed an average R value of 10 to 12, subject to significant reduction from air leakage through the chinking. Tom's system had increased the thermal resistance of his walls by nearly 10 times, achieving a level of insulation that would not become standard in residential construction for another 50 years. The classed moisture management system had also performed flawlessly. The screened foundation and ridge vents allowed a slow, continuous exchange of air within the compartments, sufficient to carry away the moisture that leaked through the log walls without creating drafts that would disrupt the insulating buffer. The surface of the spruce logs remained bone dry, with no trace of frost or mold. The reflective properties of the galvanized steel shell added another layer of efficiency. At night, as the warm log walls radiated infrared energy outward, the silver underside of the steel arches reflected a portion of that energy back toward the cabin, acting like a giant passive radiant shield. It was an integrated, highly sophisticated thermal envelope designed by a man who had never studied thermodynamics, but who understood the basic physical laws of wind, heat, and air. The January meeting of the Flathead Valley Cattlemen's Association was usually a dry affair, filled with reports on feed prices and brand registrations. But on the evening of the 12th of January 1948, the community hall was packed to the doors, the atmosphere tense, with the shared trauma of the winter storm. Tom Bradley sat at the front table, his head bowed, looking through the grim livestock loss reports. He had lost 11 of his breeding stock to the cold, and his fuel bill for the month had exceeded $600. His barn had kept most of his herd alive, but it had nearly bankrupted him in the process. Silas Thorne stood up from the crowd. He did not look at Bradley or Peterson. He looked directly at Tom Vance, who sat quietly in the back row with Arthur. Thorne addressed the place, gathered ranchers, announcing that he had some crow to eat publicly. He recalled standing on the porch of the trading post a month ago and laughing at Tom, calling him a coward for wrapping his cabin in tin and labeling his home an icebox. He admitted to placing a $10 gold piece on the table, betting that Tom would freeze out before the new year. He paused, pulling his leather purse from his coat pocket, and walked down the center aisle toward Tom's seat, laying the gold coin on the desk before him. He admitted that he had lost that bet, explaining that when he drove to Tom's place on Christmas Eve, expecting a disaster, he instead found a home at 63 degrees, with daughters wearing cotton dresses and Tom sitting in his shirt sleeves. He declared that Tom used less than half the firewood they did and kept his house warmer than any cabin in the valley, stating that he and the community had been completely wrong. Arthur Vance stood up beside his brother, his eyes moist with an emotion he had struggled to contain for weeks, and placed a heavy hand on Tom's shoulder. Arthur offered his own apology, admitting he had accused Tom of making them a laughingstock out of worry for what the town would think, rather than focusing on the safety of Tom's daughters. He declared that Tom had built exactly what was needed, and had done so with a courage he himself lacked, expressing how proud he was of his brother. The transformation that followed was rapid and widespread. The skepticism that had defined the valley's attitude toward Tom's experiment vanished, replaced by a desperate, practical hunger for information. Over the next month, Tom had a steady stream of visitors to his homestead, Ranchers and loggers who wanted to see the construction take measurements of the wooden baffles and copy his vent designs. Vernon Ehart was the first to implement the double wall design on his own cabin, using rough-cut lumber, straw insulation, and a 16-inch gap around his north and west walls. His winter fuel consumption dropped by 40% within weeks, allowing his family to survive the remaining winter months without running out of firewood. Robert Mercer, the county agent, published an official extension bulletin titled The Quonset Envelope Structure: Vernacular Engineering Solutions for High Wind, Cold Climates. The bulletin, which included detailed drawings of Tom's airlock and convective draft stop baffles, was distributed to agricultural offices across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas, introducing the Vance Shield to hundreds of settlers who were searching for ways to survive the killing cold of Comprand, the northern plains. By the spring of 1948, the green grass had returned to the Flathead Valley, feeding on the rich moisture of the melted snow. Tom Vance stood on the porch of his cabin, watching Mary and Lucy play in the yard. Lucy's chest was clear, her breathing deep and regular, the terrifying croup of the previous winter gone. Abigail stepped out to join him, leaning her head against his shoulder. The relations within their family and with their neighbors had been healed and strengthened by the trials of the winter, grounded in a new, shared humility before the forces of nature. They had not built a beautiful, traditional home by the standards of the valley's founders, but they had built something far more valuable, a safe, warm space where their children could grow without fear. They had proven that sometimes the best way to fight the winter is not to build a bigger fire, but to build a smarter shield. Tom Vance's Quonset shell still stands in Flathead Valley after nearly 8 decades. The steel arches have turned a quiet, weathered gray, showing the scars of decades of blizzards and summer suns. But the spruce log cabin inside remains dry and structurally sound. The air gap Tom engineered continues to perform its silent work, protecting the wood and keeping the interior warm through the coldest Montana nights. The story of the tin cabin has passed into the folklore of the region, told around winter fires to remind younger generations of the limits of pride and the value of practical observation. It remains a quiet monument to a Navy veteran who looked at his cold family, looked at his drafty cabin, and had the courage to try something different when different meant survival. Because in the end, the frontier does not reward tradition for its own sake, nor does it care about our pride. It rewards results. And when the temperature drops to 40 below and the wind screams through the mountain passes, the best solution is always the one that keeps the fire burning and the family warm, regardless of how crazy it looks to those who are still freezing outside. If this story has inspired you and changed how you think about traditional knowledge and the physics of survival, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. Be sure to subscribe to our channel for more forgotten techniques from the American frontier, where life was hard, but common sense was always the ultimate tool. Stay warm out there, and we'll see you in the next story.